Good afternoon. Welcome to the Faculty Forum Online, a program of the MIT Alumni Association sponsored in part by the MIT Professional Education. I'm Judy Cole, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the MIT Alumni Association, and I will serve as the moderator today. If you want to ask a question, please use the box below the live stream to submit it, and we will get to as many as possible. Our guest today is Institute Professor John Harbison, a Pulitzer Prize-winning composer who joined MIT's Music and Theater Arts faculty in 1969. Professor Harbison has written for every type of concert genre, from opera to intimate solo pieces for the Metropolitan Opera, for the Chicago Symphony, for the Boston Symphony, for New York Philharmonic, and the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center, among others. Here on campus, Professor Harbison founded MIT's Vocal Jazz Ensemble in 2010, for which he served as the coach and arranger. He is a pianist with the faculty jazz group Strength in Numbers. In 2010, the Council for the Arts at MIT awarded Professor Harbison the Kepes Prize, presented to a member of the MIT community who has demonstrated excellence in the creative arts, architecture, visual and performing arts, and writing. Professor Harbison, welcome. Can you please start by giving alumni an update on your current and upcoming projects?
I'll be glad to do that, but we have a special privilege today in the broadcast. Live music, a piece I wrote in this century, early in the century, from a collection called the Violist Notebook. And Marcus Thompson, an institute professor, my fabulous colleague, great player, great musician, is going to play this very short piece. It's entitled, I guess, or it's dedicated to Marcus Thompson, of all things.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thanks. It makes a big difference to have sounds.
It does. Yeah. So now you're going to tell us about your current projects.
My current projects are just having recently completed a piece for a string quartet, my sixth string quartet, and Sixth Symphony about 2 years ago. Coming down the road, I'm working on a very short opera, well, that actually I work at a slower pace. So at this point, I just finished a piece called Bag of Tales, which is coda, short pieces for pianists, each dedicated to a different pianist. On Wednesday in New York, all 7 pianists will show up. And play their movement.
This coming Wednesday? Yeah. Is that open to the public?
Yes, it is.
Oh, well, tell us where it's going to be.
Well, if I could remember, I would. But National Sawdust, thank you. Marcus remembers.
Thank you.
All 7 pianists will be there. They'll play a bunch of my piano music, and they will play the 7 pieces. In fact, I've been enlisted to play one piece from a series called Leonard Stein Engrams. So I've been practicing disproportionately large amounts of time, trying to really learn that 1 minute in order to be able to play on a program with real pianists.
So thank you for that. And a reminder to alumni, please use the box below the live stream to ask questions of Professor Harbison. While we wait for the alumni questions to be submitted, I have a question to start us off. Do you consider music at MIT to be, as some have called it, MIT's best kept secret? Or is the secret out of the bag now?
Well, we consider it out of the bag. I know Marcus and I have talked about this often, that we're still surprised occasionally that people don't know how much we're doing here. It's partly because MIT does so much, and it's in such a public way in science and engineering and urban planning, very newsable subjects. I think MIT students come in here knowing pretty much that there's a lot to offer, and we know that a lot of students, when they have a choice, students that are qualified for a number of different places, they will often tell us they came here because they knew about what we were doing in music.
And doesn't some enormous proportion of the students take classes in music or participate in performance groups?
It's a very large number.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And it seems to always attract a very high, very well prepared group of students. That is, students who really know that music's going to matter to them. Most of them stay with some aspect of our program right on through. So it's a very satisfying place to work. The commitment of a student here at MIT, I suppose it's in every discipline, is a follow-through. We get such tremendous commitment to every project.
Indeed.
Yeah.
So a second question that I have is, alumni who studied under your tutelage are now composers themselves and professors of music and professional musicians. They're also probably engineers and physicists as well. Can you give us a few examples of alumni working in music who demonstrate the breadth of careers in music among our MIT alumni?
Well, there are a large number. I very recently worked here with Nina Young and Andrew McPherson, both of them extremely distinguished young composers. Rome Prize winner, in the case of Nina, Andrew McPherson, both of them Tanglewood Fellows, very high distinction also, really competitive with the best young composers in the country. And we expect that. We expect that from time to time we'll have very, very highly successful musicians go into the field. They don't necessarily come here with that firmly in mind, but that often seems to coalesce rather quickly. Also in the world of performance, we've had first chair players in major symphonies as we continue to. It's going to be always, shall we say, an in the moment change of career. I would have to really strain to think of the student who came here saying, I'm going to be a professional composer. But as in the case of Nina Young, it came over her after 2 years of graduate school in science that the musical impulse was too strong not to continue. Music is like that. I mean, if you go into it as a profession, you do it partly because it takes you over. And that's happened in a number of cases.
I'm sure that's the case. So we have some alumni questions coming in now, so we should take those. Dinan in Newton, Mass. asks, whom do you consider to be your greatest collaborator, either as a musician or a composer? I'm going to add to that a librettist, because I was wondering when you said you're working on an opera, whether or not, who do you collaborate with for the libretto? And who else do you still hope to collaborate with if you had your pick?
Well, I've done 3 operas and I've written the librettos, so I'm my own collaborator. Wow. I do that only for the sake of cooperation. I don't want to have to negotiate too frequently about the detail. But I've collaborated with some great performers and composers for sure. James Levine, I would have to put very high on that list because he is such a extraordinarily complete musician, and he was so devoted to a number of my pieces, really over 15, 20 years. And I miss him tremendously in that way, in that he's restricted his conducting now pretty much to opera at the Met. I've worked with a number of very distinguished singers because, of course, I've been always a conductor of Baroque music. Lorraine Hunt Lieberson, who was also a very close friend, who I miss tremendously as a person, of course, as much as a singer. And all those pianists who are going to show up on Wednesday at National Sawdust, I mean, in the course of a career, I think those collaborations are probably the happiest part of it, that music is, it gets the composer out of the studio for sure, because you have to complete the piece with a performer. And I've worked with so many. Herbert Blomstedt, who was tremendously committed to the idea that an orchestra piece has to come back to the public, that one round is not enough. And he brought back my Second Symphony, I think, in 3 seasons in San Francisco when he was there. It's hard to not leave out great people. Dawn Upshaw, of course, from so early in her career, still working with her at Tanglewood and Bach coaching. Sandy Sylvan, in a similar way, someone I met very early. So many of these people, I always say this to my Tanglewood fellows, these people that you meet at the beginning of your life, when you're all just starting out. That was, for instance, with Ursula Oppens or Dawn, we were starting in a way, and we still are working 30 years later.
You form a close bond in those early years.
Yeah.
So who is left that you have not yet collaborated with that you aspire to?
Well, I guess I'm waiting for another conductor to make the commitment that James Levine made to me for 20 years. It's a rare thing for a composer to find that in today's world, and I had that huge good fortune. And I'm just, I guess that's if I dream, in terms of orchestral music, I dream of finding again that kind of a partnership. Barbara Hannigan, who is a great singer who I've not worked with, every time I hear her, I think, well, maybe someday I will have a chance. But I'm happy also with the great singers that I do work with so regularly at Emmanuel Music and at Tanglewood, particularly starting careers with people. One of the reasons I loved my recent assignment with this Bach study weeks at Tanglewood that I've been doing is those singers are starting their lives, and they're starting it in the music of Bach, which is, I think, the place to start a life in music.
Good tip. Mikhail in Cambridge asks, what do you think of the current state of music publishing, digital copyrights, and their future?
Music publishing is still very important, but it's extremely difficult and uphill. And I honor and cherish the people that I'm still fortunate to work with at Schirmer and Music Sales in New York. We still need publishers, but of course we can't really protect any material anymore. There's been some good sides to that the audience perhaps has been helped by streaming and by direct access to what we produce. On the other hand, the artistic side of music, whether it be pop or a concert, is now on new footing towards the public and towards usage. And I think that we have to try to emphasize the upside of that, which is that since people can get and use things with tremendous ease, that we really hope that it plays its role in audience building rather than really regretting, as we all do, I'm sure, the loss of income.
I would imagine it would have to, because there's simply no substitute for seeing a performance live. You know, seeing it on a screen, any sort of screen, is never going to be, you're not going to have the same energy.
It is a tremendous difference. And that may be one thing that's being helped. The New York Philharmonic, which was one of the toughest on protecting their broadcasts and their sounds, they were the first big orchestra to turn completely around, and their audiences have grown. So I think there is something to it. It can backfire. I really feel sorry for the Met losing a lot in the house because of the films. I know they made a big effort there to reach a bigger public. It's sad to go now some days to the Met and see the direct effect in the house. And a lot of people who like opera are substituting the film for the live performance, and of course the live performance is a fantastic thing.
Oh, totally.
That cannot possibly be duplicated by a film.
When I lived closer to New York, I used to go to the Met on a regular basis, so I appreciate what you're saying.
There's really nothing like going to an opera. The amount of extraordinary things that are happening.
Yeah.
And that's one thing I think that's been, in terms of communication with the public, that it's been hard to get across, because people think the films are really the experience of opera. And of course, if you go into the opera house, you realize they're not.
I remember from years ago, someone told me, someone who was in theater at Carnegie Mellon University told me that if someone doesn't see live theater before the age of something like 5 or 10, it's highly likely that they never will.
I think
that you need that exposure early on in
If
life.
something happens to you being in the presence of the performer.
Yeah.
And there's something sonically that cannot happen in any other way. Even the sound of voices. Yeah, I absolutely believe that, and I think that's one of the things that we, as in the artistic community, need to assert. It's actually a good byproduct, I guess, in both the pop and concert world, that it's become more necessary to bring the public into the house, because we don't have other income sources the way, particularly in the pop world. They've now discovered that they must get out in front of the public.
I would say bring the public into the house with their children.
Yeah, which is better. It's actually better.
Todd in Boston asks, you have said of the venues on campus that it is like being a great football institution with small dressing rooms in a small stadium. Do you see that improving anytime soon?
Well, we do have a real issue about that in our performance spaces, and it's been difficult at the hiring level. When we show a candidate for a position here, what the performance spaces are, we've had people turn us down. And of course we have great people who are here who are struggling to make a great program with spaces that are not competitive. And we're also, some of us who go out to a number of other institutions to perform or to take part in their programs, we are struck by how really below standard MIT is in the arts. And we've made our case, and we're continuing to make it. Kresge is a great building, famous for good reasons, and the chapel as well, but they were not built for the performance of music, or for theater performances for that matter. They've been pressed into service for 70 years. And it's not the fault of the architect, because he did what he was asked to do, which is to make a forum for speech, for lecture. So the other spaces are makeshift and temporary, and we regard them as such, and we do great work in them. And our students do great work, but I think we are waiting.
Well, I understand what you're saying there too, because when you try to serve too many purposes at one time in one facility, you serve none of them as well as could be hoped.
I think Kresge was built with the expectation that other venues would take up
follow
as specialists. Because Kresge, I love it. I love it more and more. I think its brilliance as a building doesn't fade, but its inadequacies for many of the things it's asked to do remain.
So, going back to what we were just talking about in the previous question, Nathan in Springfield, Massachusetts asks, can you talk about how you first got into classical music and how you advise parents to engender that interest in their children?
Well, that was it. My parents played on the piano, and we had a phonograph, and I soon learned to pick out things I wanted to hear, and particularly my father playing versions of Bach chorale preludes on the piano. That was what got me going. And playing jazz. He was I'd not say a real jazz player, but he played the standards, and I learned a lot of those tunes when I was just a kid. And I think that's where, in the home, this is where it happens. Some people get it just by foraging around. It's harder to do that in a way because radio is not playing the role that it once played in bringing music to kids. or at least in terms of bringing concert music and jazz and more esoteric kinds of so I think the parents, even if they are not musicians or not particular practitioners at all, if they can just show children where it is, you know, how do you find it?
Yeah, expose them to it and
Yeah.
let them hear it.
And because that's more the parents than the schools now. The
Yes.
schools unfortunately took quite a hit a long time ago
Yeah.
in terms of the arts. And so it's really at home, and then the wonderful channels, there are still always channels, places where people can learn to really become effective in these various arts. These wonderful youth orchestras in so many cities, which are incredibly spirited environments and incredibly powerful in terms of their effect on the lives of young musicians.
Indeed. So moving along, Andrew in Charlotte says, can you talk about a student's piece of music that you loved so much that you listened to it often?
Yeah, I can. Just kind of off the top of my head, my recent Tanglewood students, we choose them. We used to choose them perhaps for more responsible reasons than we came to. But now when we do auditions, we have 100, 120, we would listen to them, we would bring it down to about 20, and we would pick the 6 that we wanted to listen to for 8 weeks. Just as members of the crowd, really. And in that way, Ju Riseo's Piano Sonata, I love it. I mean, it's crazily adventurous and peculiar. I could remember quite a few pieces from certain pieces of Helen Grime, a young British composer who came to us about 8 years ago at Tanglewood. Yeah, of course I groove on these pieces because that's why we chose them.
Yeah.
We wanted to hear more of what they did, or you know, and I think that finding that criteria was a freeing thing for us as instructors, as well as I think just about thinking about the profession.
What criteria were you trying to use before you came to that conclusion?
We were trying to be, we were trying to, in a way, predict something about these applicants.
Predict success of some
We're
sort?
trying to predict a line of development we're seeing, but rather than just being almost kind of pleasure hounds, you know, of what are they able to do now, and that proved to be a better vector.
I can see why.
Yeah.
So Bonnie in Washington says, as a former student of yours, I'm in awe of all you've done with your vast repertoire and compositions in the past 20 plus years since I took your class. Given the recent political environment, including announcements to consider defunding NEA, National Endowment for Humanities, how do you feel opportunities will be impacted with regard to moving music and the arts forward?
Well, we've never, for many, many decades, depended on government support in the arts. The very fact they've announced again and we're going to defund the arts is just a joke, because compared to other countries that are serious about this, we're not in the game. So really what it's about is this old system that we've always had, which is really private patronage. And we need to embrace and celebrate people who are game enough and adventurous enough to participate in that. It can be an exciting and stimulating thing for people to be interested enough in the arts to want to really step up and make sure they keep going. And I'm encouraged that there's a lot of signs of vitality within that system. We can't look to any other systems of the kind that Germany and France and England have made work so well. We're just not in that frame of mind. They look at our tradition, really as a tradition of philanthropy in the arts, as somehow corrupt, but I look at the government system over there as corrupt. I mean, it's all a social network which produces, hopefully, occasionally some really worthy good things. I'm just writing a piece for Chanticleer, which is a vocal group in California, Now, Chanticleer has existed for now probably 30, 40 years as a male, all-male choir, an unlikely thing, but supported locally, really from the San Francisco area, with amazing following, and by concert music standards, a really popular audience. This is doable. So I've just read the other day the big announcement, we're not going to fund the arts anymore. Well, that's just completely mirrors. That's
You're not funding it now,
nonsense.
So Maxine in Boston says, I majored in engineering, but I minored in music at MIT, and I loved it. I am a classically trained pianist. Are there musical groups available for alumni like me to join?
Yes, actually, I can't give specific references, but I know in two cities, in San Francisco and in Minneapolis, there were MIT Music Network groups.
So she's here in Boston. Do we have one in Boston that you're aware of?
There must be one in Boston, yeah. Well, informally, the Longwood Orchestra has long been a kind of MIT inhabited group. A lot of people who are pre-meds here who go on and keep on playing. There must be in Boston. And
there are a lot of
office probably
smaller
hasn't tracked.
musical groups in Boston, it seems.
Oh,
I'm always
indeed.
seeing announcements about their concerts. So.
Yeah, but I was always impressed by the vitality of the San Francisco MIT musical network. Seemed to go generation to generation.
Jeevan in Miami asks an interesting question. Where does inspiration come from for you? Do you see music and art as more in the act of creating or in the act of performing?
Well, for
How do
me,
you tease those apart, actually?
I think what I've learned about inspiration is that you don't disdain even the most fragmentary sort of indication of a direction. I learned to write down so I remember even little fragments that seem to have no potential. Because I work always on the basis of sending out a runner. If I have anything like a melody or a chord that will run out ahead and show a direction, I just learning to value the unconscious, and the things that don't seem to be potentially useful. I get as much out of the not potentially useful as the things that I'm quite sure about right away. I think that pragmatism is something that I try to suggest to the Tanglewood fellows that I teach, who are so highly gifted, but that's where the independent side creeps in, is if you begin to respect the things that don't fit.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Ken in Chicago says, can you talk about a commission you've turned down or work you have abandoned, something that has challenged you or still haunts you for leaving behind?
Well, I did commission. I've turned down a couple that I eventually did, that I feel lucky that I changed my mind.
Why did you turn them down initially, and what turned you around?
I turned down the commission from the Chicago Consulate of the State of Israel for the 50th anniversary of the establishment of Israel, which eventually turned into a piece called Four Songs, which I think is one of my best pieces. I turned it down for a number of reasons. I was pressing towards completing an opera, Great Gatsby. I didn't think I had time. And I was a little worried that they had chosen a non-Jewish composer for this really big commission, though the commissioning body seemed quite confident that that's what they wanted to do. And I called the consul general when I changed my mind. I said, I've just haunted, it's like a couple months later, I said, is there any chance I could still get into this? He said, well, yes, it's awkward and shame on you and so forth. But I felt incredibly fortunate to get back into the project because it had haunted me. I thought this was an opportunity. First of all, for study, sometimes the research behind a piece is as valuable a part of the experience as anything, that you have to learn so much to just be able to grasp what the piece could be about. And in that case, I studied sort of very beginning Hebrew. I knew I wanted to work in Hebrew, some of it, and I went to Israel for a 3 week period. It was an incredibly irreplaceable enlargement of my experience. And I think that's the kind of thing. I guess about the things I've turned down, I usually try to say, well, it wasn't salvageable. I don't look back on that. But I have been, more than that time, I've been haunted and been able to save the project.
Well, the fact that that ultimately came around says to me that it was meant to be.
Yeah, I don't know. It meant that the group, which I discovered later, the commissioning group in Chicago were very engaged. And in fact, when I submitted my text, every one of them, every element of the text was objected to by the commissioners. And eventually the consul general stepped in and said, we hired this composer and we better respect what he wants to do. And so I did it, and I hope that piece makes a few more appearances, because I think, sadly enough, it's still as relevant now as it was quite a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and another alumnus question, Jim in St. Louis says, regarding radio, I hear less and less classical music on the radio where I live and have resorted to podcasts and YouTube, but I'm my own DJ there. What else do you recommend for keeping abreast of contemporary composers online or on air?
Yeah, radio is a big loss now. We learned so much about what was going on in music from radio, going way back to when I was very young. I got my job as composer in residence in the Pittsburgh Symphony because of radio. A piece of mine came on Andre Previn's car radio, and he pulled off to the side of the road and waited to get an ID, and I wound up going to Pittsburgh. And that was when radio was still a live force in all kinds of music. And even jazz has lost a huge amount of ground on radio. So I think the substitute source is the websites of composers of all kinds, both pop and concert, where sometimes entire pieces are available, publishers of composers. That's become the substitute venue for finding out about music. And sadly, you have to kind of know what you're looking for.
What about the websites of some of the classical music, the famous classical music stations in Boston and New York and other major cities, so like WGBH?
Yeah, I think that's helpful, but it's not nearly as good as what we did have, which was the ideas of some programmer who really put together a broadcast. I'd say that the undergraduate radio stations, the college radio stations, are doing best. Certainly in this city. HRB still hangs in well at Harvard, Emerson. That's our best hope, because there you have an enterprising junior who, a couple of years ago, I heard a great broadcast on the bass player Ray Brown by a jazz hound who knew everything Ray Brown ever recorded. And they get an hour and put on a great broadcast. That still can happen because so much initiative there.
Right.
But in general, we don't have. Most radio is very little dedicated to music of any kind.
Toby in Singapore says, I am grateful to you for being my chamber music professor when I played cello at MIT. My 6-year-old son is now learning about music from one of your composition students, John Sharpley.
Indeed.
Can you talk about when you developed your interest in composition and how you were encouraged to develop your musical writing style?
Well, I started young. A lot of composers do. And I had written pieces at a very, very small age, like, it's 5 or 6, 8, 7 years old. And I had a teacher in high school who was my piano teacher, but she didn't like the way I played the piano. I was already a jazz player, and she didn't want to listen to me swinging Beethoven and that kind of thing. So she looked at my pieces then. So I got a lot of support just by saying, here it is. I'm doing this, and I had the advantage of some quite interested teachers. I think again, this is a good situation where the parents and and the children can work together at that first stage. Over and over, as I look at biographies of composers who turned it into really productive practitioners, a high percentage had that parent at the start, right in the midst of it. And there's really that kind of early help it's a really, first of all, it makes you feel less weird because socially those kinds of interests they're hard to fit into.
They tend not to be the
Yeah.
mainstream fad kinds of interests.
Indeed. I regretted for many years I was invited to play in high school assembly, and they said, play anything you want for high school. So I played the pieces I was working on, which were the Schoenberg piano pieces, Opus 11, and all the girls I was interested in stopped. They ran away, and my friends didn't invite me out for a long time. And I was, I guess, very naive. I thought this was interesting to me. But because one is, as a young musician, even a jazzer now, is somewhat isolated by the intensity of what they're doing, that parental support's very helpful. Parental and teacher support, I guess, because you do take a different social track.
I think that's probably true of any passion that a student pursues as intensely as most of our MIT students pursue their
Absolutely.
passions.
That's
And,
what I
and
see
that's,
in them.
that may be what they find in each other when they come here.
I see that in MIT students. I recognize it, and some of them have been through socially awkward high school experiences because they are so wrapped up in something. And for me, it was concert music, which was, a fairly rare passion. The jazz helped, but jazz already by that time was becoming another form of rather specialized appreciation. So, yes, it was great in college to meet some more people that were a little like that, and I think MIT is an unbelievable meeting place for people who've been nurturing extraordinary projects on their own.
Yeah. Jill in Brookline says, speaking of Kresge, it was built with a pipe organ built in. So perhaps the design for music was just not up to the goals.
Well, the pipe organ was part of the original commission, and it was because it was being envisioned as a public events site for MIT. The pipe organ, it makes me sad to hear our questioner mention it, because of course it was a major instrument, as was the one in the chapel. Both are in disrepair, and organ repair is so expensive, it's probably far down on the to-do list. But the reason for that great Kresge organ being put there was that these sort of great state occasions that are part of a big university were going to occur there.
You need triumphal music.
Now
or
there
whatever.
isn't much on that organ that we can use, and it's both the MIT organs are awaiting a very unusual and perhaps crazed kind of benefactor, a deeply organ-loving benefactor, because they are among the great instruments in the city. And of course, at this point, they're unheard. But they speak of another era of university life where I guess that kind of ceremonial conclave is less frequent. But the Kresge organ, when I first before I was a faculty member here, I heard it, and it was one of the big grand organs of the region.
Mason in Dartmouth, New Hampshire, says, your work testifies to your love of poetry, e.g. the arrangement of Louise Gluck's The Seven Ages. Can you tell us more about how you incorporate poetry into your process when composing?
That's my main ancillary reading is poetry, more than novels, and I do like short stories. Novel reading is sometimes, it's too time spanned a thing for me. Poetry I read all the time, and I get the Poetry a Day thing from the Poetry Foundation, I get Poetry Magazine. I'm like someone who comes into the Grolier bookstore and they say, you don't seem to be a poet, what are you doing here? And poetry means a lot because it sort of brings in the kind of world I want to be in when I'm working. And I have felt the collaboration of poets, dead or alive, to be a huge changing force in my life. In the Louise Glück case, I've had the great fortune of, after setting her, becoming a friend of hers and really understanding something about her off-work world, which is meaningful to me, and for which I feel kinship.
Wow. Larry in Scituate, Mass. says, Lloyd Schwartz called Gabriela Diaz's performance of Your Violin for Violin Alone in December one of the highlights of the year. What are your impressions of how this piece has been interpreted?
Well, that was a very wonderful occasion for me, but that piece has a strange history. I'm not quite sure why, but the commissioner of the piece, Jennifer Coe, a very distinguished violinist, played it 4 times, never making a recording of it or really commenting on the piece. So I had never really heard the piece until 2 friends, Daniel Stepner and Gabby Diaz, both did the piece this season. And so that was my first acquaintance with the piece, by then 4 or 5 years back. I was tremendously glad that both of those players took the piece on, because it's a large piece and it's a big chunk of one's life. When you're a composer, when you haven't met the piece in the real, in the room, you don't have a completed relationship to it. I mean, obviously you should know what you did, more or less, you know, but you don't have the rest of the equation, like what happens when it's in a room with people. I used to be annoyed when a couple of my colleagues, older in those days, my experienced colleagues, said, you listen to the way people are breathing when your piece is being played, you know, you listen to the coughs. You listen, these are all indicative of how you are holding them for that amount of time. I didn't take it seriously at the time. I do now. And that's part of what completes a piece. And certainly that occasion with Gabby playing, and also with Dan a few weeks before that, I managed to get that last sort of lap with that piece. That sort of, a little bit of relaxation occurred too, that because you evaluate sort of how close does it come to what you were trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that, I can see where the creation of a piece, the composition of a piece, and then the performance of a piece are sort of integrally intertwined in terms of that whole process.
But the performance is the other end of you know, and as much as we don't worry about that when we're writing the piece, because that would be inhibiting in terms of what you're going to try in the piece, at the point when it's done, you're waiting for a circle to close.
So at the grave risk of running over time a little bit, we are going to take the one last question from Don, class of '61, Booth Bay, Maine. He says, I'm an old grad who is writing music, chamber music, choral music, songs, and 5 operas. It would be marvelous to hear some of my works performed in Kresge. Is there any chance of that?
Well, you do what composers do when you write pieces. You try to get immediate colleagues who you can trust to really work on them, and provide some sonic material that you can send out. Or you can send out scores. People are not as energetic at really studying scores as they once were, because the sound material is easier to get at. But that's what composers all do. And what I always say to this is the veteran, obviously a veteran musician here, what I always say to the young composers is that you have to get a community around you, a few people who will do some work on the pieces, so that you can make that equation we were just talking about. Mm-hmm. And it's from that base that you expand outwards. And that it seems that this questioner must have someone or some people around who will say, I'll take this piece, I'll learn it, we'll get a really good version of it, and we'll get people interested.
Do composers pitch directly to performance groups sometimes?
They do, I find that the most effective is the fewer people you're pitching to, the better.
The easier it is to
Yeah.
sell them, yeah.
Right.
Well, what I was thinking is, look up some of the student groups on campus and
Oh,
pitch
sure.
it to a student group and see if they'll take it on.
Absolutely, and of course, we do here at MIT, with some of the student ensembles, we do compositions by their colleagues, which is a really logical equation. But I think, I think of the people that I gave pieces to or that asked for pieces when I was just starting out, Ursula Hoppens. I'm still with people like that. Bob Levin, my gosh, yes. It's been, how many, 50 years, but it still works.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you so much, John, on behalf of the MIT Alumni Association for joining us here today. This has been a terrific conversation. And thanks to the alumni for tuning in for the questions. If we did not get to your question, we will pass it on to Professor Harbison after the webcast, excuse me. And you can also share other reactions or further questions using hashtag #MITBetterWorld. Archived past faculty forums online can be viewed by visiting the Learn section on the Alumni Association website. And please join us again later this week for another session of Faculty Forum Online.